Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I was thinking over the situation with the Society of St. Pius X, and I wanted to make sure that we opined correctly on it. The Catholic Church has a very simple principle. For some reason, however, modern ecclesial revolutionaries keep finding that principle impressively difficult to understand. It's simply this: obedience to legitimate authority belongs to the structure of communion and the covenant hierarchy. It's not debatable. This is why the announced plan by the Society of St. Pius X to consecrate bishops without the papal mandate is grave. That act claims loyalty to their movement while damaging the very apostolic communion of Catholicism that they claim to uphold. Now, canon law has been clear on this. I mean, it could hardly be less ambiguous. Canon 1382, this is in the 1983 code, it states, "A bishop who consecrates someone a bishop without a pontifical mandate, and the person who receives that quote-unquote consecration from him incurs a latae sententiae excommunication that's reserved to the apostolic see." Now, that's extremely clear. That code of canon law is the Church's way of saying that Rome already placed the warning sign directly on the road. None of us can claim surprise if people willingly drive through that warning sign. You look at Canon 751. Schism is the refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff or of communion with the members of the Church subject to him. And that matters greatly. Schism always begins throughout history with the religious language that what I am doing is in the name of the faith. You take a look at history, it's always been the case. It begins when anxious men try to explain how Rome has failed them, the magisterium has failed them, the Pope has failed them. Ordinary ecclesial authority is theoretically sacred, sure, but practically, we can't follow them. It's optional in this immediate case. That's the claim of the SSPX. When you put it in the simplest terms, that is the exact claim. The SSPX claims of necessity that it is the guardian of the true faith. And so everything from the Second Vatican Council onwards is subject to what they call the heresy of modernism. They've granted themselves the authority to preserve the Church from the Church. The absurdity of this ought to be alarming to all of us. St. Ignatius of Antioch, in his writings, gave the early Church a principle that's painfully relevant here. Wherever the bishop appears, there let the people be. As wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. Now, that sentence alone should give us reason for pause. We don't have a right for private emergency mechanisms when it comes to the faith. We're not a group that can profess to protect the true, genuine Catholic identity, but refuse the ordinary grammar of Catholic communion and obedience to the hierarchy. And that's why the irony is a little thick about this issue. Because radical traditionalism, and in this case the SSPX, they speak as though the crisis in the Church requires heroic fidelity to Catholic tradition, but devoid of obedience to its legitimate magisterium. The Catholic tradition has actually never taught that ecclesial disorder is healed by an unauthorized episcopal line in defiance of the Roman Pontiff. So you look at the First Vatican Council, it taught that the Roman Pontiff has full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the whole Church, which means that papal authority has a real jurisdiction over global matters involving faith and morals. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to pretend every statement, every off-the-cuff opining that comes out of the Supreme Pontiff is necessarily binding on the matters of faith and morals. I mean, we all know situations, especially during the Francis papacy, that have caused us to, at the lowest level, scratch our heads and wonder what he actually meant. So yes, in that sense, we can grieve deeply over some sense of disorder within the Church, and we can ask serious questions. But even in those questions, we have an obligation of filial reverence and defending the doctrine of the Church with genuine fidelity to the discipline of communion. We must never confuse our woundedness or our confusion with ecclesial self-authorization. That makes us no better than Protestantism. The church is a covenantal body, which means there is a visible hierarchical structure over and above an abstract one. So when someone asks, well, what do you mean by Catholic? I'll tell you what I mean by Catholic. Communion with the Holy Roman Pontiff and all of the cardinals and bishops and priests in communion with him. Whether you like it or not. By the way, I'm a convert from low church Protestantism. I can tell you in no uncertain terms, we didn't have that semblance within the assemblies of God. Thank God for visible communion in the Supreme Holy Roman Pontiff. And that's why you can compare the SSPX with what's going on the other extreme with the German bishops. Their rebellion is in progressivism. On the flip side, the SSPX rebellion is in traditionalism. They despise each other with a vengeance, but they have the exact same spiritual disease. Both claim a kind of obedience, but both are draining Catholic moral teaching from obedience to the hierarchy. The Germans insist that their proposed blessings of, in this case, homosexual couples, unions, what have you, preserves Catholic teaching, the real Catholic teaching. The SSPX insists that preserving the faith as it existed in all of its trappings before the Second Vatican Council is what's necessary because that's the real Catholic faith. That's what's needed to preserve the faith. Both factions are using whatever version of polished theological vocabulary they have, but their disobedience, you can polish it up however you want, is still disobedience. You can dress it up in the trappings of words that will confuse the conscience, but it is still disobedience. The Catholic faithful must recognize the devil has no objection to Latin chant when it is coupled with schism. He also has no objection to the language of inclusion when it becomes moral rebellion against the magisterium. So the deeper issue here is where the church receives her identity, whether she receives it from apostolic authority or from individual interpretation. Because if it is individual interpretation, then Luther was right. But if Luther wasn't right, and we know from scripture and from history that he really wasn't, then we know Christ founded a visible church upon Peter. Because human beings are remarkably gifted at first off, confusing our private judgment with some divine revelation. But second of all, on the flip side, as a good thing, we're gifted at seeing structure where structure exists, and we're gifted at being able to give our allegiance to it if we recognize it. The Catechism teaches that the Roman Pontiff, by reason of his office as Vicar of Christ and as pastor of the entire Church, has full, supreme, and universal power over the whole Church. That can irritate modern instincts, sure, but the deeper theological point is obedience in the Christian tradition is a necessary component of the covenant family. Obedience is the ordered surrender of the will and intellect to the truth as mediated through the rightful authority of our spiritual fathers within the covenantal life of the Church, with the Holy Father as our prime father, and all other father figures, the cardinals and the bishops in communion with him, as subordinate fathers in this great family that is the Catholic Church. That's why Aquinas tells us, obedience is due to superiors according to justice. A superior is placed over another in order to direct him to God. That's because Catholic obedience is not blind submission, it is discerned submission. So in all areas that there's a violation in faith and morals, we can legitimately ask questions. But when we know that there is no violation thus, obedience is demanded of us. That's the massive difference. If we accept that principle, then we can start healing the fragmentation in the Church. If we reject that principle, we will be the agents of fragmentation in the Church. So look at the Holy Father. He's praying that the leaders of the SSPX reconsider its decision. The goal he wants is the return of his sons to the hierarchy of the Church. He doesn't want to make a public spectacle of them. And so, again, make no mistake about this. The ball is in the court of those who are part of the movement of the Society of St. Pius X. Man cannot preserve his family by burning down the house and rejecting his father. This structure, this hierarchical structure, was instituted by Christ and preserved by his apostles, and the Eucharist is at the center of that hierarchical structure. So pray for them, and let's keep working towards unity within the Church. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.